Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the quieter corners of royal history, the part that happens after the trumpets fade, the battles end, and the crowns roll across the floor. You can dim the lights if you like. Get comfortable. Maybe you're already lying down. That's perfect, because tonight's story isn't about conquest or coronations. It's about what came after those glittering moments, when the kings were gone and the queens were left behind. So, what happened to the wives of fallen kings? The short answer, nothing good. The longer answer, which is what we're here for, involves lonely castles, awkward remarriages, prison towers, and occasionally, a quiet kind of resilience that history forgot to mention. Let's begin where many royal misfortunes do, in medieval Europe. Isabella of France, the she-wolf. Left with the crown. You might know Isabella of France as the she-wolf of France, which sounds very dramatic, but in reality, Isabella's story is a bit like watching a soap opera filmed entirely in slow motion. She was born in Paris in 1295, a daughter of King Philip IV, a man so handsome they called him Philip the Fair, though his fairness extended mostly to his bone structure, not his personality. At age 12, Isabella was married off to Edward II of England, because of course, she was. Now, Edward was complicated. He liked boats, peasants, and a man named Piers Gaveston, not necessarily in that order. Piers was Edward's favorite companion, his confidant, and depending on which chronicler you ask, possibly a little more than that. Isabella, the teenage queen, found herself mostly ignored, which in royal marriages wasn't all that unusual, but Edward made a performance of it. He showered Gaveston with jewels, titles, and affection that would have been scandalous even by today's soap standards. Eventually, the English nobility decided they'd had enough of the royal bromance. They captured Gaveston and executed him. Edward was heartbroken. Isabella was quietly relieved, briefly. But Edward, being a man of consistent bad decisions, soon replaced Gaveston with another favorite, Hugh Despenser. Despenser was cruel, greedy, and politically disastrous. Isabella detested him. The kingdom detested him. Even the cooks in the royal kitchen probably detested him. By the time Edward's reign collapsed into rebellion, Isabella had had enough. She did something unusual for a queen of her era. She switched sides. She fled to France, gathered support, and led an invasion against her own husband. It worked. Edward was captured, imprisoned, and eventually murdered under circumstances too unpleasant to describe before bedtime. Let's just say it involved a red-hot poker and a complete lack of subtlety. Isabella became, for a brief and shining moment, the most powerful woman in Europe, the queen who had dethroned her king. But power, like all royal luxuries, doesn't last long. Her son, Edward III, grew up and decided he didn't like the idea of being ruled by his mother and her new favorite, Roger Mortimer. So, naturally, he staged a coup. Mortimer was executed. Isabella was placed under gentle house arrest. And that's where her story ends. Not in triumph, but in a quiet, comfortable exile. She lived the rest of her days in a country estate, playing cards, reading, and occasionally being visited by her son. History called her the she-wolf, but really, she was just a woman who tried to survive a marriage that was doomed from the start. Anne Boleyn. When fallen king meant fallen queen. Let's drift over now to Tudor England, a place where royal wives didn't just lose their husbands, they often lost their heads. Anne Boleyn knew that better than anyone. She wasn't married to a fallen king, she was married to a king who fell on her. Henry VIII was, by all accounts, charming in youth and horrifying by middle age, like milk left out too long. When he met Anne, she was witty, fashionable, and unafraid to say no, which only made him more obsessed. He divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, broke with the Pope, and declared himself head of the Church of England, all for Anne. It was one of the most dramatic breakups in history, with the added twist of religious reform. For a while, Anne seemed untouchable. She was the queen, mother to a daughter named Elizabeth, and the most talked-about woman in Europe. But then she did the one thing a queen couldn't safely do. She failed to produce a son. Henry grew restless. He found new favorites. And Anne, brilliant, sharp-tongued Anne, found herself accused of treason, adultery, and, for extra scandal, incest with her brother. The charges were absurd. But this was Tudor England, where absurdity was a form of policy. Anne was executed in 1536 at the Tower of London. So, what happened to her as a wife of a fallen king? Well, in a way she was the one who fell. Henry remained safely on the throne, remarried, and repeated the process until he finally exhausted both his wives and his waistline. But Anne's story didn't truly end with the blade. Her daughter Elizabeth would go on to become one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling alone, without husband or heirs, as if to say, "I've seen what marriage can do. No, thank you." So perhaps Anne's revenge came quietly, decades later, through a daughter who would outshine them all. Hey again. If you've somehow wandered here after the last story, welcome back. If you fell asleep halfway through a royal downfall and woke up to find yourself surrounded by axes and gallows, well, that's historically appropriate. Tonight we're drifting quietly into the shadowed corner of medieval towns, the place everyone pretended not to see, the executioner's house. You know the man. Leather hood, heavy boots, probably smells faintly of smoke and guilt. But the truth is less dramatic and far more peculiar. Executioners were, in many ways, ordinary people, doing an extraordinarily awkward job. No one applied for the position. You didn't wake up one morning and decide, you know what would really fulfill me spiritually? Decapitating criminals. More often, the role was inherited. If your father swung the axe, congratulations. You were now next in line for a career that guaranteed lifetime employment and 0 dinner invitations. Sometimes it was assigned as punishment. A thief, spared the rope, might be told, "Fine, you can live, as long as you agree to hang the next one," which is one of those medieval win-win situations that actually felt like a loss. The towns needed someone to do the dirty work, so they kept the executioner, fed him, and prayed they'd never have to shake his hand. Executioners lived apart from everyone else, usually outside the walls, near the gallows, or beside the leper colony, because of course they did. Their houses were sometimes marked with a red door, a warning that said, "This home is necessary, but please don't visit." When the executioner's family went to market, people stepped aside, not because they were afraid of being harmed, but because they feared bad luck might rub off. Medieval superstition was a full-time hobby. Children were told not to play with the executioner's kids. Yet, paradoxically, if someone had a stubborn tooth or an abscess that needed lancing, guess who they went to? The same man they shunned, because executioners were often the only people with a working knowledge of anatomy. However, practical that knowledge was. It turns out being an executioner didn't pay particularly well. So naturally, they diversified. They became informal surgeons, bone setters, and veterinarians. They brewed potions, and most curiously, they sold relics, tiny souvenirs from their grim day job. A scrap of rope from a hanged man could fetch a fine price. People believed it cured illness, improved fertility, and occasionally helped win lawsuits, because the Middle Ages had a very broad definition of medicine. Some executioners even sold the blood of the executed. It was considered a treatment for epilepsy. Physicians frowned upon it, of course, but the patients were too busy not ceasing to complain. So yes, the man who cut heads by day might hand you a vial of healing blood by night. A multitasker before LinkedIn made it cool. For all the stigma, executioners did enjoy a few advantages. They were exempt from taxes in many towns. They received free lodging and the occasional barrel of beer, because morale matters when your office decor includes gallows. They were also legally untouchable in certain ways. If an executioner killed a condemned man, it wasn't murder, it was civic duty, which made them both powerful and powerless at once. They could walk through a marketplace feared and avoided, yet the local lord would bow slightly as they passed, murmuring, "Ah yes, my man of justice." It was a strange, liminal existence. Part civil servant, part pariah, entirely necessary. It's easy to forget that executioners had wives, children, and sometimes very awkward dinner conversations. Their families shared the same stigma. An executioner's daughter could rarely marry outside her caste, so over generations, the families intermarried, not for romance, but survival. In cities like Nuremberg, Entire dynasties of executioners formed, with records stretching for centuries. And yet, within those homes, life went on much like any other household. Children did chores. Mothers cooked stew. Fathers sharpened axes. The kids grew up learning two lessons: how to keep secrets and how to live without neighbors. Not unlike teenagers today, just with fewer emojis. Public executions were the closest thing the medieval world had to live entertainment, a grim kind of festival. Crowds gathered early, selling bread and ale. Peddlers shouted, priests prayed, and at the center of it all stood the executioner, silent, professional, and probably wondering why this had to happen before breakfast. Precision mattered. A clean strike meant divine order. A messy one invited riots. If he botched it, people screamed. Sometimes they threw things. So, to maintain confidence, executioners developed flair. A dramatic swing. A solemn bow. Showmanship, really. The medieval version of stage presence. They were expected to embody both justice and mercy, while quietly hoping their own necks wouldn't one day meet the same block. After the cheering stopped and the crowd shuffled away, the executioner stayed behind to finish the practical details. Bodies had to be buried, sometimes dismembered for display, occasionally boiled. Don't worry, we won't linger there. It was quiet work, often done at dusk, with no one watching but the crows. That's the part of the job history never romanticized, the loneliness that followed the noise, the stillness after justice had been served, and the town pretended nothing had happened. If you had wandered into the life of, say, Meister Franz Schmidt, the famous 16th century executioner of Nuremberg, you'd find a surprisingly diligent man. He kept detailed diaries, wrote beautifully, recorded every punishment he ever performed. He also treated patients between jobs. Over his career, he executed 394 people and medically treated about 15,000. When he retired, the emperor actually pardoned him and granted him the status of honorable citizen. Imagine spending 30 years cutting off heads and still getting a good reference letter. Schmidt lived out his final years quietly, attending church and collecting herbs for medicine, a model of civic virtue with an unusually grim resume. Executioners were picky about equipment, and for good reason. Swords were prized possessions, often beautifully crafted and engraved with pious verses, because nothing says devotion quite like scripture on a decapitation blade. The axes, heavier and more practical, were kept sharp and sometimes passed down like family heirlooms. Some even had names. Ropes were carefully chosen for elasticity. Too stiff and it snapped. Too soft and it strangled. Precision mattered. A good executioner didn't enjoy cruelty. He aimed for efficiency. The gallows, the wheel, the block, these were in their own way tools of order, not symbols of chaos but of control in a world always teetering toward it. Moments of mercy. Not every execution ended in horror. Some ended with quiet compassion. Executioners often prayed with the condemned. They offered last words of comfort, even forgiveness, because they understood, better than anyone, how thin the line between the living and the dead could be. A few even risked their lives to spare victims unnecessary pain, swinging faster, cleaner, or looking away so the final sight wouldn't be the blade. It's odd, isn't it? The man everyone feared might be the only one showing kindness at the end. Retirement plans. When executioners grew old, they faced a dilemma. They could rarely change professions. No one wanted to hire the man known for executions as a pastry chef. So most petitioned for pensions or opened small medical shops. Their children sometimes escaped the trade, moving to new towns under new names. If anyone asked about their family history, they simply said, "We worked for the city," which was technically true. A few managed full redemption, granted coats of arms, allowed to join guilds, even marry into respectable families. By then, though, the line between justice and shame had blurred beyond recognition. The man behind the mask. It's tempting to think of medieval executioners as faceless brutes, but most were pragmatic professionals, not sadists. They lived under laws stricter than anyone else's. They swore oaths. They carried a burden society didn't want to admit existed. That order sometimes required violence, and so they lived quietly, dutifully, at the margins, half citizen, half ghost. At night, when the torches were out and the gallows loomed dark against the sky, They probably lay awake like anyone else, wondering if God truly kept a separate ledger for those who obeyed the law too well. And when we drift away. So, how did medieval executioners really live? They lived cautiously. They lived apart. They lived in a world that needed them and despised them for it. They carried out justice by day and searched for forgiveness by night. And if history remembers them only as shadowed silhouettes, maybe that's fitting. They were never meant to stand in the light. Soft exhale. If your eyes are heavy now, that's fine. The job is done. And if you're still awake, thank you for keeping me company through this quiet little corner of history. You can like the video, or subscribe if you'd like more stories whispered from the darker edges of the past. Next time, we'll drift to something gentler. Maybe what ancient children did for fun. The playtime of civilizations long asleep. For now, rest easy. The bells have stopped ringing, the crowd has gone home, and the executioner finally can close his eyes. Hey there, if you're still with me, or if you've just woken up somewhere between a guillotine and a lullaby, welcome back. Tonight we're leaving the gallows behind. No kings, no queens, no executioners. Just children, ancient ones. Because even in civilizations that spent most of their time inventing taxes and plagues, somebody still had to figure out how to play. So, let's settle in. Slow your breathing, and drift back a few thousand years. To a world where toys were made of clay, laughter echoed through dusty courtyards, and bedtime didn't include Wi-Fi. Egyptian playtime. Let's drift down the Nile. Ancient Egypt gave us pyramids, mummies, and a level of administrative paperwork that would make a modern accountant weep. But the children? They played under the same sun that warmed the stones of the Sphinx. They chased each other through alleys, swam in irrigation ditches, and rolled hoops made of papyrus stems. Their dolls were charmingly practical, little wooden figures with painted eyes and hair made of string or clay beads. Some had tiny wigs, because even at age 6, fashion was serious business in Egypt. Games of balance and imitation were common. One popular pastime was catching fish, not with nets, but with quick hand movements in shallow water. Another was keep away, which required one child to run while others threw sticks, apparently for fun, though it sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen. There were board games, too. Adults loved Senet, the forerunner of backgammon, but children joined in, learning both luck and patience. In tomb paintings, you can see them crouched over boards, grinning, unaware that their play would be frozen forever in pigment. Greek mischief, ancient Greece, the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and an unusually high tolerance for sculpted nudity. Here, childhood had a brief but lively stage before boys were shipped off to school or the gymnasium. They played with balls made of pig bladders, the original sports equipment. Some learned to juggle stones or roll hoops with bronze sticks, a pastime so popular that poets wrote about it. Imagine being immortalized in verse for what was essentially the ancient version of rolling a tire down the street. Girls stayed home more often, but they had dolls carved from ivory or wood, sometimes jointed so their arms could move. When a girl reached marriage age, she was expected to offer her childhood toys to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. A symbolic goodbye to innocence, though probably a tearful one. And yes, the Greeks had pets. Children loved puppies, birds, and occasionally monkeys, because apparently chaos was also a virtue. One surviving vase shows a young boy teasing a goose, which feels universal. Thousands of years later, kids are still bothering geese. We've evolved technologically, not emotionally. Roman childhood, order and mayhem. The Romans perfected everything: roads, aqueducts, empire building, and then naturally, childhood, or at least their version of it. Roman children had marbles, dice, spinning tops, and dolls with removable clothes. Some were made of wax, others ivory. Rich families went all out. Miniature furniture, tiny dishes, even dollhouses, because excess was Rome's default setting. Boys played war. They practiced sword drills with wooden sticks, forming little legions in backyards, because nothing says innocence like rehearsing for conquest. Girls played domestic games, setting miniature tables, pretending to run households. Though to be fair, Roman households were practically small cities, so the training had some merit. They also had a game called Nuts, involving throwing or flicking small nuts into a circle, like ancient marbles. Winners kept the nuts, which must have been devastating during snack time. Street games were boisterous. Hide-and-seek piggyback fights, tag, and the wonderfully named the hand game, which seems to have involved slapping your opponent at just the right rhythm. Basically ancient rock-paper-scissors with mild violence. And, naturally, there were pranks. Roman graffiti mentions children tying amphora lids to dogs' tails and letting them clatter down the street. History doesn't record what happened next, but the dogs probably started a union. Farther east, children of China. Let's drift across continents to ancient China, where children's play was gentler, but no less inventive. Kite flying began here, colorful paper creatures soaring above rice fields. At first, kites had military uses, signaling troops, measuring wind. But soon children adopted them, turning warfare technology into art, as children tend to do. They also played shuttlecock, jianzi, kicking a feathered object with their feet without letting it drop. It's still played today, usually by adults pretending they're not out of breath. There were yo-yo-like toys made of bamboo spools, whirring with a pleasant hum. And, of course, storytelling. Elder siblings told ghost tales around oil lamps, probably scaring each other just enough to ensure no one slept well. Education was serious, but even Confucius admitted that play trained the mind. So children studied calligraphy in the morning and invented games of mimicry by afternoon. Balance was key, even in fun. India, play beneath the banyan. Ancient India had its own worlds of laughter. Clay toys shaped like elephants and carts have been found from the Indus Valley, some with wheels that still turn after 4,000 years, which is more than we can say for modern plastic. Dice games were hugely popular, so popular they made it into the Mahabharata, where the fate of empires turned on a single unlucky throw. It's unclear whether ancient parents let their kids gamble, but knowing humanity, probably yes. Children also flew paper birds, spun tops, and made swings from tree branches. One ancient Sanskrit verse describes a little girl scolding her doll for misbehaving, proof that pretend parenting is truly timeless. Desert play. Children of nomads. Out in the deserts, Bedouin tribes, Berbers, Mongols. Childhood meant motion. Games had to be portable. They used bones as dice, stones as markers, and sang rhythm games to keep time on long journeys. Children practiced riding early, turning skill into sport, racing camels or horses in miniature contests. Sometimes they simply drew in the sand, creating worlds that vanished with the wind, which, if you think about it, is the perfect metaphor for all childhood. Bright for a moment, then gone. A few games that survived. Some of their amusements lasted millennia, quietly evolving. Tag became universal. Marbles never died. Board games multiplied. Senet led to ludus latrunculorum, which led to chess. Each generation reshaped play to fit its world, yet kept the same purpose: to learn, to imagine, to be briefly free from the rules adults insisted on. Because fun, it seems, is humanity's oldest rebellion. Childhood wasn't all games. Of course, it wasn't all laughter. Many children worked early, herding goats, grinding grain, fetching water. Their toys were scraps of that labor, a clay ox, a tiny cart, carved during rest. But even then, they found joy. A Roman poet once wrote, "The child at the mill sings louder than the stone." That feels about right. Why play mattered. Across every civilization, play served the same quiet magic. It taught balance, strength, patience, imagination. It let the powerless pretend to have control, and it softened the edges of hard lives. When you see a clay doll from 2000 BCE with its eyes still wide open, you can almost hear the child who held it, laughing, maybe scolded for playing too long before chores. You can feel the small warmth of someone who never dreamed of being remembered, and yet, somehow, still is. And so we drift back. So what did ancient children do all day? They played, they worked, they pretended. They built little worlds inside bigger, harsher ones. They ran through dust and grass, argued about rules, and fell asleep mid-game, the same way children still do. History rarely writes their names. But the toys they left behind are tiny love letters to joy itself. Soft pause. If your eyes are heavy now, that's fine. The children of Babylon are asleep again, their clay boats resting by the canal. Somewhere, a Greek boy's hoop has stopped rolling, and the wind carries a forgotten kite back to Earth. Thank you for drifting through history with me. If you'd like more quiet wanderings through the past, you can like, comment, or subscribe. Gently, of course. No rush. Next time, we'll drift into another odd corner of history. Perhaps the one where kings argued over spoons, or where monks accidentally invented champagne. But for now, rest easy. The ancient children have gone to bed, and so should we. Hey everyone, welcome back. Or if you've just joined us tonight, welcome to this strange and soothing corner of history where we talk about the less glamorous details of the past, very quietly. So go ahead, dim the lights, find that perfect spot under your blanket, and let's drift together into a topic that everyone's thought about, but few dare to ask out loud. Before plumbing, before privacy, and long before scented candles, how did people handle bathroom time? Because, let's be honest, even emperors had to go somewhere, and in many cases, that somewhere was not a pleasant place. So tonight, we'll float gently through thousands of years of human ingenuity, or desperation, as we explore the humble beginnings of one of civilization's least glamorous, yet most essential daily rituals. Let's start with the ancient world, when human civilization was still figuring out fire, farming, and personal hygiene. The first recorded toilets date back over 5,000 years in ancient Mesopotamia. And by toilets, we really mean a small clay seat over a pit, not exactly the throne one might imagine. The wealthy in cities like might have had indoor setups, with drains leading outside the home. The poor, on the other hand, relied on the classic find a corner and hope no one notices method. Egyptians, predictably, were a bit more refined. Some homes featured limestone seats with sand-filled bowls underneath. Servants would, rather unfortunately, be the ones responsible for removing the sand, because nothing says social hierarchy quite like being paid to carry other people's mistakes. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, things took a surprisingly communal turn. Public toilets weren't private little rooms. They were large stone benches with evenly spaced holes. Imagine a long line of people chatting about politics, philosophy, and last night's olives, all while taking care of business, shoulder to shoulder. Privacy, apparently, was overrated. And of course, the Greeks being the Greeks, they even had their own version of toilet paper, a piece of broken pottery, called a pesos. Yes, they used pottery shards, and sometimes archaeologists have found those with names scratched into them, presumably enemies. So yes, the Greeks invented both democracy and petty revenge. But the Romans, naturally, took the idea and built an empire on it. They had massive public latrines decorated with marble benches and running water. Water would flow continuously underneath the seats, carrying away waste into underground sewers. Which sounds fairly advanced, until you realize there were no walls between seats. So once again, you'd be surrounded by friends, strangers, and possibly a senator or two, all enjoying some quality time together. They even shared a communal sponge on a stick, the tersorium. You'd dip it in a water trough, use it, rinse it, and then put it back for the next person. Because nothing says empire quite like a shared hygiene implement. It's almost poetic that Rome eventually fell, not to invaders perhaps, but to the logical consequences of communal sponges. After Rome's collapse, Europe slid backward into something less efficient, more fragrant. Medieval castles and towns weren't exactly paragons of sanitation. Most people simply used chamber pots, ceramic or wooden bowls kept under the bed. In the morning, the contents were emptied into the street, sometimes with a warning shout of Gardez-vous, meaning watch out for the water, which might be the least accurate warning in history. Imagine walking down a narrow medieval alley, minding your business when suddenly, a bucket of someone's night gets introduced to your day. It's no wonder so many towns smelled like despair and onions. For those living in castles, the nobility, who at least liked to pretend they were above it all, there were garderobes. These were small stone rooms jutting out from castle walls with a wooden bench and a hole that led directly down to the moat or ground below. The word garderobe literally means clothes room because people often hung garments inside to keep moths away. Apparently, the smell was enough to kill insects and possibly anyone else who entered. If you were especially unlucky, Cleaning the garderobe might be your job. Medieval records mention gong farmers, individuals hired to dig out and dispose of waste from cesspits. It was a decent-paying job, considering the risk of, well, falling in. They often worked at night both for discretion and because the smell was less overwhelming in the cool air. So next time you think your job is bad, remember someone once got paid to shovel royal waste under the moonlight. By the Renaissance, things had improved slightly. Cities like Paris and London tried building sewers, though most were just open ditches politely called drains. People continued using chamber pots, sometimes emptying them out windows or into designated corners of the street. Visitors often complained that European cities reeked of filth, which, to be fair, they did. One writer described walking through 16th century London as an assault upon the nose, which was likely the most British understatement of the time. Even in royal palaces, the situation wasn't much better. At Versailles, during the reign of Louis XIV, there were over 10,000 courtiers, and only a handful of proper toilets. Most guests simply found a hallway, stairwell, or even a fireplace. The smell became so infamous that scented gloves and perfumes were basically survival tools. So the next time you see a portrait of a powdered noble looking serene, remember that room probably smelled like a swamp, made of roses and regret. Across the world, other cultures had their own unique solutions. In Japan, toilets evolved early into sophisticated designs, often with bamboo piping and flowing water. Farmers even collected human waste, called night soil, as fertilizer. It was efficient, if slightly unsettling. In China, ancient cities had multi-level latrines, some with ventilation systems. The Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an was said to have thousands of restrooms available to the public. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, people were still arguing over where to dump their chamber pots. So, yes, some parts of the world handled things a bit more gracefully. The real revolution came in the 16th century, when a man named Sir John Harington, godson of Queen Elizabeth Thursars, invented the first flush toilet. It was a wooden seat with a cistern of water above, operated by a lever. Elizabeth found it fascinating, but didn't exactly rush to make it standard. Perhaps even royalty wasn't ready for plumbing gossip. It took another 2 centuries for flushing toilets to become mainstream. By the Victorian era, inventors like Thomas Crapper, yes, really, helped refine modern sewage systems, and with that, the world slowly began to smell a little less historical. But even then, not everyone had access to plumbing. Rural communities continued using outhouses, small wooden sheds built over pits. They were cold in winter, terrifying at night, and occasionally home to spiders large enough to deserve rent. Yet for many people, it was a step up from the medieval bucket system. So, what does all this tell us about humanity? That civilization isn't just about art or science, it's also about comfort. The ability to go in peace without risk of judgment, disease, or falling into a moat is a quiet victory of progress. Our ancestors might have conquered nations, built cathedrals, and written epics, but deep down they were just like us, relieved when they found a good, clean place to sit. So, as you drift off tonight, remember, the next time you flush your toilet, you're participating in one of humanity's most underappreciated achievements, a long, slow march toward dignity and plumbing. Sleep well, and be grateful that you're not living above a medieval cesspit. And if you're still awake, maybe tap that like button softly, and subscribe for more midnight wanderings through history's quieter corners. Good night.